significance of those who are not in the professional jobs, the so-called big jobs. But let me say that whenever we're engaged in work that supports the building of humanity, that serves humanity, it has dignity and worth. And one day our society will come to respect the sanitation worker if it's to survive, because the person who picks up our garbage is just as important as the physician. If they don't do their jobs, diseases run rampant. And so all labor has dignity. This is a poem from the Harlem Renaissance, part of America's past, our history, but a part of our history that we're still not done with any more than we are done and finished with Dr. King's dream and vision for our nation. And it's a poem that I think speaks to how labor can both dehumanize and degrade, and at the same time ennoble the human spirit. It's called Brass Spittoons. Clean the spittoons, boy. Detroit, Chicago, Atlantic City, Palm Beach. Clean the spittoons, the steam in hotel kitchens, and the smoke in hotel lobbies, and the slime in hotel spittoons, part of my life. Hey boy, a nickel, a dime, a dollar, $2 a day. Hey boy, a nickel, a dime, a dollar, $2, buy shoes for the baby, house rent to pay, gin on Saturday, church on Sunday. My God, babies and gin and church and women and Sunday all mixed with dimes and dollars and clean spittoons and house rent to pay. Hey boy, a bright bowl of brass is beautiful to the Lord. Bright, polished brass like the cymbals of King David's dancers, like the wine cups of Solomon. Hey boy, a clean spittoon on the altar of the Lord. A clean, bright spittoon, all newly polished. At least I can offer that. Come here, boy. Lord, don't give up on us yet. Instead, help us to listen to your voice, which we hear in the voices of the dispossessed and the poor, those whose work and will and determination not to quit make our world go. Help us to remember our sisters and brothers who pick our fruit, who milk the cows, who empty the bedpans, who stock the shelves, who are the foundation of so much that we enjoy, people like ourselves with kids and families and loved ones, but who struggle for their daily bread, who live in debt. Forgive us our debts, and lead us not into the temptation of thinking that others are any less deserving. Make us instruments of your peace, that thy will might be done. Some of you might think that Bernie Sanders has some pretty wild ideas, but I think we can all agree he has pretty wild hair. Bernie's fond of reminding people that when Martin Luther King Jr. was in Memphis, Tennessee, the day he died, he was not there to fight segregation. He was there to support a strike by the city's sanitation workers. The garbage men, almost all of them black, had just formed a chapter of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, demanding better wages and working conditions. There had been 2 garbage men who'd just been crushed to death when one of the big compactors on the old trucks malfunctioned. But the city wouldn't recognize the union, and when 1,300 workers marched off their job carrying signs reading, "I am a man," the police broke up the rally with billy clubs and mace. You go back and look at the images. There were tanks in the streets. Looked like Tiananmen Square in Tennessee. After the mayor threatened to fire every one of the striking workers and a local court ordered an injunction against any more demonstrations, the union's leaders called on Dr. King to come to Memphis, which was an invitation he had to accept because the biggest obstacles preventing people of color from fully participating in the American dream weren't just the color line, they weren't just racial, they were social and economic in nature. What good is it to sit at a lunch counter, he often asked, if you can't afford the hamburger? So he had to go to Memphis to campaign for working people's right to an honest wage. And Bernie has that part of the story right, but that's not the half of it. You know, what most Americans remember about Dr. King is his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, delivered from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. But if his voice carried that day, it wasn't thanks to his corporate sponsors, because he didn't have any corporate sponsors. His support came largely from the United Auto Workers. They were the ones who paid for his microphone, who paid for the electricity, who funded all the logistics of that great march. Walter Reuther, the head of the UAW, he was on the platform with Dr. King and the other organizers. It was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and the real organizer, the real instigator of it, was not Dr. King, but another labor leader named A. Philip Randolph. You may have heard of him. He was the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. It's the biggest black union in the country. And like King, he was the son of a minister, but at the age of 74, he was more of a father figure to the fledgling civil rights leader. According to one biographer, King all but idolized Mr. Randolph because he'd overcome seemingly impossible odds to win victories for his people. First, he'd taken men who were dispirited and disorganized and given them esprit de corps, a sense that together they could accomplish things that they could not do alone. In an era when the railroads were the Silicon Valley, they were the powerhouses of the American economy. The Pullman Company was the undisputed king of the rails. It had a near monopoly on passenger travel. It promised luxury and comfort for the weary travel, first-class service with lavish personal attention, all thanks to its army of menial servants, the lowest paid employees on the line. These black porters, out of their meager wages, they had to pay for their own meals on the road, the brushes and polish to shine the shoes, that came out of their own pockets. Any missing linens or stolen items were deducted from their pay, and anyone talking union was immediately fired and blacklisted. But Randolph led a 12-year struggle against the world's biggest, most powerful corporation, and he won. In 1937, the nation's first black labor union signed its first contract, which reduced the porter's hours from 400 down to 240 a month. For Randolph, though, that was just a start. 4 years later, with the outbreak of war in Europe, the Depression was ending for many white Americans, but as usual, in bad times, blacks were last hired, first fired, and Randolph wanted to see African Americans get some share of the jobs in the defense plants, the factories that were starting to churn out war material. So, with the Brotherhood's backing, he threatened another massive march on Washington, and as a result, Franklin Roosevelt created what he called the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which ended discrimination in government offices and in companies with government contracts. A few years later, while Martin was still in divinity school, Randolph and his union had an active civil disobedience committee that worked with Truman to end segregation in the armed forces. So when he was looking around for models and mentors, Dr. King didn't have to look to Thoreau or Tolstoy or Gandhi. You know, he had inspiration much closer to hand. It's safe to say that most of the tactics of the civil rights movement were pioneered by labor: the picket sign, the protest march, the sit-in, the boycott, the mass meeting. These didn't materialize out of thin air. They were developed by working men and women in their struggle for decent wages, for insurance and paid retirement and other benefits. Even the song we just heard, "We Shall Overcome," had labor roots. A. Philip Randolph sang that song back in the 30s. Most of us know we trace the modern era of the civil rights movement back to that day in 1955 when a tired seamstress named Rosa Parks in Montgomery refused to give up her seat on the bus, but not as many know that she was a graduate of the Highlander Folk School, which was a Southern center for training union organizers. And it's almost forgotten that the initial organizer of that Montgomery bus boycott was a man named E.B. Nixon, who was a member of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. So Nixon had this idea that they would boycott the buses, and he started calling local pastors. His third or fourth call was to a local minister who was new in town at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, Martin Luther King Jr. Nixon explained his plan, and King said he needed some time to think about it. So while King was thinking about it, Nixon called the rest of the names on his list and then called back Dr. King, who said, "Okay, well, that's good." Nixon said, "I'm glad you're on board because yours is the only church downtown and I've got 18 people coming at 3 p.m. And it would look kind of bad if you weren't there." That night, King's eloquence stirred the crowd, but as the boycott just dragged on for months, people were carpooling and walking to work, anything to keep from taking those buses. It dragged on and on and on, but Nixon's tale of how the Brotherhood had held out for 12 years against the Pullman Company helped strengthen the resolve of the black community till they finally carried the day. After that, King went on and founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which had close ties with labor, along with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the Packing House Workers of Chicago, and New York's Chapter 65 of the Distributive Workers of America all contributed to the coffers. In fact, King became an honorary union member of Chapter 65 when he was stabbed while signing copies of his book, Stride Toward Freedom. A. Philip Randolph paid the hospital bills. When he was later arrested and put behind bars in Alabama, where he wrote his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, it was the United Auto Workers who came up with the rather formidable bail to get him back out on the street. It could be said that he owed his influence and probably his life to the help of organized labor. And he also, of course, shared with the unions a concern for the little guy, the underdog, the manual laborer, the ladies who mopped floors or took in laundry, the kids who had to quit school to go to work, who were sick because they lived next to the smokestacks and had asthma and couldn't pay the doctor's bills. King saw people without enough to eat, without health care or affordable shelter, a sea of plenty with islands of deprivation. And he was moved by that. He'd read the Hebrew prophets. He was familiar with the Christian Gospels that said to feed the hungry and clothe the naked. And he knew that this was a commandment that wasn't just directed at individuals, at private charity. It was directed toward all of us, toward our whole community, which was under an obligation to provide a share of the goods of life for all of its members and not just for a few. It wasn't enough to be a good Samaritan on life's highway, he said, helping our neighbors when they'd fallen by the wayside. Instead, we had to challenge a system where so many were beaten and robbed and made destitute and bankrupt on this highway. He thought that the role of government in a democracy was not just to provide, but to promote the general welfare, and that a nation that every year spent more on missiles and aircraft carriers than on social uplift was a nation approaching spiritual death. And he said this in his speeches again and again, and if he were alive now, he'd still be talking about it. I think he would be talking about the raids last month by ICE in Mississippi, where hundreds of workers in chicken slaughterhouses for Coke and Pecos Foods, they just won a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against their employers for racial and sexual harassment. Those workers belonged to the United Food and Commercial Workers. And they were arrested so they could be deported, just like workers a year before at Freshmark in Salem, Ohio, where laborers belonging to the Retail, Wholesale, and Department Store Union, they got raided by ICE after winning a big judgment against their employer for unsafe working conditions. Just like a restaurant worker 2 weeks ago in Brooklyn was arrested by ICE while actually giving a deposition to his attorney to claim unpaid wages. It's intimidation. In Mississippi, 2 Pecos workers suffered amputations as the speed of the slaughter line increased and the number of federal inspectors dropped, and they would deny it. There's no proof, but I would imagine it was the bosses who called ICE to retaliate against their workers belly aching. I think Dr. King would be talking about Walmart, which fired all of their butchers when they voted to form a union, and which now only sells pre-packaged meat, like the meat from Coke and Pecos Food. Coke brand chicken cravers, Parmesan bacon-filled nuggets. Can you believe that? There's actually a product like that on the shelves. It's cheap meat. It's from underpaid, overworked, often underage, at-risk workers on the killing floor. Sometimes trafficked kids, like the ones from Guatemala who were rescued from slave-like conditions on an Ohio eggplant, Trillium Farms, that now produces 4 billion eggs every year. Every day the work is the same, said one teen who was interviewed by the PBS news show Frontline. Speaking in Spanish, you sweat the chickens. They crap in your face. The manure falls in your eyes burn, your clothes, they get dirty, completely filthy. We pick up the chickens that fallen from the cages. There's lots of dead chickens. They reek. They're rotting. That's how the work is. Very hard. Walmart used to get their eggs from DeCoster farms up until 2010 when DeCoster went out of business after giving 56,000 Americans salmonella. And then DeCoster sold out and became Trillium Farms, where these teens were working. So is it Trillium now that sells their eggs to Walmart? I truthfully don't know, but I invite your help. It's very hard, even in this age of information, to find out where our eggs are coming from, or how they're being produced, or what's happening behind the closed door of agribusiness. So confirm it, refute it, I don't care. But, I think this is probably part of the way they sell eggs so cheaply at Walmart. They use forced labor. The bosses hire subcontractors who will provide them with workers. The subcontractors entice young people, 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds from Central America to come up with promises of a bright future, and that bright future turns into 8 people living in a trailer with no plumbing, no running water, no electricity, no heat, working 12-hour days to pay back the $15,000 they owe the coyotes who smuggled them across the border. They're in debt bondage. There are threats to kill their parents or take away the deed to the family farm if they complain. And there's plausible deniability at every stage. Go to Trillium Farms, go to their website and read their human rights policy. And then watch the Frontline documentary and see what you think. What we do know is that the Walton heirs are now earning $4 million an hour, while their starting workers earn 11. In my mind, that's a crime. It's an injustice. I think King would be asking why Amazon pays no taxes, why its bazillionaire CEO earns almost $9 million an hour, which would take an Amazon worker 170 years to accumulate if they worked 24 hours a day. Martin Luther King would give hope to his listeners. He would remind us of the tremendous progress we've made, but he would also say that having Ben Carson in the cabinet and Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court is less a measure of how far we've come than how far we still have to go to realize that dream of equality. He would still be saying that he'd seen the promised land of brotherhood and sisterhood, but there's still a long journey. It'll take work and discipline. Take voter registration drives. Take coalition building between churches and labor unions and students and environmentalists. I think he'd tell us that we're living in difficult and dark times, and there may be darker times ahead, but don't give up. Don't give in. Don't get mad. Don't despair. Get organized. The question, how long will it take? And I say to you, however dark the hour or difficult the moment, it will not be long. How long? Not long, because no lie can live forever. How long? Not long, because truth pressed to the earth will rise again. How long? Not long, because you still reap what you sow. How long?
Not long.
Because the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice.
Amen.